Okay, good evening, everybody, and welcome to this Academy Ideas Education Forum. My name's Shirley Lawes, and I'll be chairing this, our second Zoom discussion during lockdown. And it's great to have so many people signed in this evening. Our question before us, that I think is a fairly hot topic, is it time to reopen our schools? And this discussion was partly prompted by the social media outcry against an article published in the Daily Telegraph recently by one of our speakers, Joanna Williams. And also really following that, over the last couple of weeks, the issue has become central to the lifting lockdown debate. So we're delighted this evening to welcome Joanna here and to explain why she thinks it's time for schools to open again. Joanna's the director of the Freedom, Democracy and Victimhood Project at Civitas and founder of the think tank PIO. And she is joined by David Perks, who's the founder and principal of the East London Science School. David, who's completely in the thick of things at the moment, in fact always is going to tell us how he sees the quite substantial difficulties in getting schools back to normal. Or perhaps it's the new normal, as the saying goes now. Okay, so we'll follow our usual format, which for those of you who, those of you who are new to the forum, is that Joanna and David will speak in turn for around about 5 minutes, but I think Joanna wants possibly 1 minute or so more, but I will be strict at 7 minutes, okay? Because I think we want to bring the audience in. So they'll speak in turn, and then I'll open the floor to our participants here, to you, the audience, this evening. You'll notice that you've been put on mute, and that will stay the same. It will stay like that until you want to speak. And it's really so that we can all hear individual contributions and there's no background noise. So if you'd like to ask a question or to make a contribution to the discussion, then you need to press the raise your hand icon, and then I can ask you to speak as time goes by. And Harley Richardson, who's dealing with all the production side of things, will unmute you. We'll probably take 5 or 6 contributions and then go back to Joanna and Dave for their comments and responses. And then I'll come out again 3 or 4, hopefully probably as many as 4 times during the course of the discussion. And then finally coming back to Joanna and Dave to make their final concluding remarks. As there's so many of you signed in this evening, and I guess quite a number will want to speak, can I ask you to be fairly succinct in what you want to say? And a short question is fine. Joanna and Dave will respond to the things that they most feel, you know, they need to respond to, as it were, and they probably won't be able to respond to everything. But if we were going down the pub, we could pick up, but unfortunately we're not tonight. But perhaps we can have that discussion that we don't get to at a later date. If you want to make a contribution but really don't want to speak, there is a chat icon on the bottom of your screen, so you can make your contribution through that. And if I get time during the course, or there's anything that I think I can, I'll share. But if you don't want me to share with who you are, that's fine. All right, so let's get going. Joanna, would you like to start the ball rolling? Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Shirley, and great to see so many people. I just wish I could see you all in real life. So my view, very bluntly, as I think the entire country knows what I think now, in 2 sentences, I don't think schools should ever have closed in the first place. Given that they are closed, I think they should look to reopen as soon as possible. By reopen, just to clarify, I mean as normal and without social distancing in place. So that's my view, very, very bluntly. I thought I'd just get that right out there at the beginning, so that if the Wi-Fi cuts out, at least everybody knows what I think. In reality, I think actually my view is a little bit more nuanced than that. I think there should be a presumption that schools are open. But I think there should also, quite importantly, be room for head teachers to make individual decisions about their own schools within the specific context in which they're operating. So, for example, if you're running a small infant school in rural Lincolnshire, for example, you're going to be facing a very different set of issues than if you're running a large sixth form in the centre of London or Glasgow or Birmingham. And I think it's really important that head teachers are able to exercise that judgment. So I think it's important, though, that at this point, given where we are now, today, I don't think the government can just kind of shrug their shoulders and say, okay, schools, it's up to you. Head teachers, this is entirely on you. You make the decision. So that's why I'm choosing my words quite carefully here. I'm saying I think there should be a presumption that schools should be open. I think the government should say that schools should be open. The expectation should be that they're open, but with room for individual flexibility. And I think that exercising of judgment by the head teacher is really important. I also think there needs to be judgment as far as individual teachers are concerned. Again, the risks faced by a young 20-something woman teaching in a junior school are very, very different to the risks faced by a man in his late 50s who's perhaps got some underlying health conditions and teaching in a secondary school. Again, to perhaps be a bit more nuanced with the comments I'm making about social distance, I think clearly reinforcing the message about hand washing, about using hand gel, things like that, I think are just sensible. So that's what I would like to see happening. In reality, where are we now? Well, schools are closed to all. I think the government had the assumption that up to 20% of children at one point would still be attending, the children of key workers and vulnerable children. In reality, I've heard various reports that there's between 1% and 2% of children. Obviously, teachers are working incredibly hard to get lessons online, but it seems fair to say that there's huge variation with schools at one end of the spectrum running everything from registration at the normal time, Zoom lessons, and giving children a full school day with very little difference apart from the fact that they're sat in the kitchen rather than in the classroom, to with the other end of the spectrum, children being given virtually no work sent home at all. It seems to me that most schools are in the middle somewhere along that spectrum. At the same time, we've got teachers, the teachers' unions, over 200,000 signatories to a petition, and now Rebecca Long-Bailey, Shadow Education Secretary, saying that schools shouldn't reopen until the science tells us it's safe for them to do so. Now, my big problem is with that. My problem's with the teaching union leaders, the signatories to the petition, and that particular stance that schools shouldn't reopen until the science tells us it's safe. My reasons why I have a problem with this: the science might never tell us that opening schools is 100% safe. Coronavirus might be here to stay. So the question I'd raise is, do we then close schools permanently? Do we prepare to go over to a permanent online teaching? Point number two, safe might mean until a vaccine is developed. The earliest estimations of this are between 12 to 18 months at very, very earliest. If so, I think the teaching unions need to be very honest and come out and say, we do not want schools to be reopened for at least another 18 months. And our expectation is that schools will be closed for 18 months. Third point is, the reality is that much of the science around coronavirus is still unsettled. There's not that much that we know with 100% certainty. We do not know what role children play in transmitting the virus. So we're taking a precautionary principle in keeping schools closed, and we need to be upfront about that. I think there are some things that we do know. We do know that children and younger adults generally are the least likely to catch coronavirus. They're the least likely to display symptoms. They're the least likely to get taken seriously ill, and they have a negligible chance of dying if they do catch coronavirus and do get taken seriously ill. Sadly, I think from my understanding, and I'm very, very happy to be contradicted in this, children especially stand far more chance of dying in a road traffic accident on the way to school than they would do from catching coronavirus at school. even if the science on coronavirus was completely settled, science never can tell us when schools should reopen. Science can't answer that question. It's a moral, a political, and a social decision. Science can inform our thinking, but it can't tell us when schools should reopen. And I think to suggest otherwise really is a bit cowardly. It's hiding behind the science, looking for science to prevent us making this decision.
Okay, so I'm going to have to stop you. You've had your 7 minutes at the moment, Joanna. Do come back with the other points immediately afterwards, all right, in the discussion. Okay, Dave.
Hi. I think Joanna's brought forward some of the points I was going to look at in a different perspective, I think. Where do I stand on the issue, just, you know, in case the line goes dead? I think we should go back now, because I think in terms of where the disease is, I think it's over in terms of the threat it poses to pupils, teachers, and everybody else. I think we're in a position now where we're in a kind of stalemate where nobody can see a way out of this. Now we started it. However, that's not where we started off. So I remember when we shut the school, we did it early. We didn't wait for the government. We were one of the first to go. And as a school in East London, with about 600 kids and about 100 staff, I had absolutely no choice but to shut. Okay, so I'm, you know, and it's not about me being a late 50s adult with a few health issues. Thank you, which is true, and it hit me quite badly personally. But it wiped out my entire senior leadership team, so that not one of us ended up being able to function for 3 to 4 weeks. I've still got one member of staff whose breathing is shot and is, you know, hoping to find a way out of that. And in terms of the remainder of the staff, I would guess 60 to 70% of the staff went down, no matter what age. And in terms of who it hit hardest, actually, one of my younger senior leadership colleagues was the only one who got hospitalised. So I think it's very difficult for me to accept the sort of bland assumptions that it doesn't hurt younger people. It hurt all of us. When we shut, you know, I had literally no choice but to close. I'd lost 20 staff the day before and 30 in the last day. Was physically incapable of maintaining my own sort of position as a leader, and had to get the kids out of there. It was carnage. Right? So some attempts to explain this are trying to say in a way that it's not really that serious. Well, if you lived in East London where we are, it absolutely clobbered us. Newham is probably one of the worst boroughs in London, if not one of the worst places in the country for this. And you know, there's all sorts of ways you can explain it, but you know, it's quite a poor borough. People live cheek by jowl. It hits us, and it's not obviously just kids and teachers in schools, because it's their families. So in, you know, the worst aspect of it to me is not what happened to us or the kids, it's their families where they've lost people. And that's, you know, not just one, it's several families we've had people who've gone. So just number one point, and that is, it was a real disaster, no question. However, the thing to me then is not that we shut schools because I had no choice, and I think to say otherwise would be silly. Should we have shut all schools? You know, that's a point I would sort of say that depends on how you're going to approach dealing with this crisis. I don't particularly think it was a too difficult a decision to make to shut schools for a brief period, as long as you know what you're doing in terms of ending this. So if you say, you know, a brief period we shut down in order to try and keep people safe, as much as we can, which is a human thing to do, to look after people, then fine. But in terms of a protracted, sort of never-ending situation, I actually agree very strongly with Joanna in the sense that the idea that social distancing is something we can maintain, and that is the way that we should understand this, I think is a total disaster and will cripple everything, not just schools, unless we get rid of it. And I think that the government, and I'm not blaming the government directly for the situation we're in, but the government know that, and they're trying to get out of it, and they can't. Much the same as everybody else. And therefore, what we need to do is have a really robust discussion about, can we ditch social distancing and get back to some kind of normality? Because if we don't, then I think the return from this is going to be worse than actually the lockdown that we've taken on board. We will not be able to run a school if we have social distancing. It just doesn't make sense on any level, and as someone who's trying to plan the return now, I'm tearing my hair out and trying to work out, well, what on earth is it they're going to tell us we're supposed to do, and whatever it is, unless it's all come back, it's a disaster. So just a couple of scenarios educationally. I mean, we've already lost the GCSE. Of really fast scenarios, right? We've already lost the GCSEs, which is horrendous for those kids, and we're dealing with that now. But it's the kids who have not done their GCSEs, the year 10s and 12s, if you like, and what they're facing. And my massive concern is how to explain this to them. If we don't bring them back properly, their GCSEs are done now anyway, and their exams are finished. And in fact, it might be the end of the entire examination system. It might not cope with this. And so what we're dealing with is not just a kind of technical issue about, how do we keep people safe? It's about the structure of education, full stop. Unless we sort it out, it will by default be in a disastrous place.
Okay.
I'll leave it there.
All right, yeah, if you can leave it there, and both of you, I know you've got more to say, and I obviously will be bringing you back to say that. But there seems to be a measure of agreement between the two of you there. But on what basis? I mean, where would you see, Joanna, where would you find disagreement with Dave? Or do you think that really he's facing up to problems and that's...
Yeah, definitely. No, I mean, I can't sit here and say hand on heart that I wouldn't have made the same decision as Dave made if I was in his situation and running that school. It does genuinely sound like you had very little choice. I mean, I think where perhaps, I'm not sure, but where perhaps the disagreement is, Dave, is that I actually think there's a huge difference between shutting down one school because of one particular set of circumstances for the minimum amount of time as is necessary, compared to shutting down en masse all schools in the entire country. And I don't think that distinction is just to do with the lack of a backup plan, or, to me, it's a very important kind of moral and social and political distinction. Because when you shut down an individual school, the kind of national project, if you like, of education continues, and your school has some catching up to do, and the pupils at your school have some distance to make up when they return. But as a collective society, we've maintained education. We've maintained the project of bringing children into a school. We've maintained responsibility for them, and we've continued to educate them. So, I mean, one thing that people said to me a lot in response to the Telegraph article that I wrote is, I'm catastrophizing. Children often get sick. I mean, I think probably less so nowadays, but certainly when I was a kid, I had every illness going and missed huge amounts of time off school. And, I might say it didn't do me any harm. Lots of people might disagree with me on that. But I think the difference is, when I was off school with scarlet fever or chickenpox or whatever it was, I was aware that my peers were continuing, my classmates were carrying on. When I came back, there was a kind of objective ground for me to make up. When we close schools entirely, what we're saying to children is that actually knowing about the 18th century in history, you know, knowing about the structure of a cell in biology, knowing about, I don't know, whatever it might be in physics, these things are just not important. It doesn't matter that you've missed those things, you know. And then, as Dave points out, it then leaves the open the issue of exams. And there's already, I noticed, been lots of talk from the teaching unions about either cancelling or altering in some way the 2021 GCSE exams on the basis that we can't possibly expect this cohort of students to make up the lost ground. So it's best if we just kind of stop this now. And I think that's really damaging. Yeah, and I think if one or two schools had closed, we wouldn't be in that position.
Okay, right. Thanks, Joanne. David, are you saying that you just want to reopen your school and just carry on as normal?
Well, the point I'm trying to make is that's impossible, right? Almost regardless of what I want. Because, I mean, we do not work in isolation. Our entire community is messed up by this. And so I talk to head teachers in the local area. They're obsessed with feeding people who haven't got food. They're obsessed with the damage that's being done now. Never mind the consequences of the economic collapse that's about to impinge itself upon us when we do come back. Once they get rid of furlough, God knows what's going to happen. So actually what they're predicting is that people are going to flee the borough, right? Because there's not going to be any work. We are at the beginning, not the end of the consequences of this. Right. And the point is we're not even thinking it through about what we're trying to do. So yes, of course I want to come back. I'm desperate to get the kids back, but all of them at the same time, not 5 metres apart, 2 metres apart, normally, which in our school is very close together because it's quite a small school. So, and therefore we just get on with the job. And in terms of education, I think I'll just pick up on what Joanna said. It's like, you can't blame this crisis for the collapse in belief of a knowledge-based education. That was already there. All this is doing is accelerating that collapse and tearing it apart because it was already fragile, right? We are arguing flat out the opposite whilst we're in our online educational state. We're offering the subjects, we're offering the education. We're not giving up on the kids and we're fighting for their education. But I can't change what the exam boards are going to do, Ofqual and Ofsted and all the rest of it. No. And they're going to collapse. No question. They're going to let go. So we are in a moment where we might see the consequence of this, as in many other areas of society, is that the values we hold to in education are just ripped apart. And you can see people tearing it apart now, the unions, etc., on the basis of some kind of health and safety crusade.
Okay, thanks. So I bet there's, well, there are a lot of people who want to come in now with things to say themselves. Now, I know that there's quite a number of you who are regulars in the Education Forum, but I'm not necessarily going to take the regulars we'll just have a trawl through. Okay, we've got Lauren Mitchell. Would Lauren like to put her question or make her contribution, please?
It's actually Marcus with Lauren.
Okay.
I'd like to start by agreeing with Joanne and saying that we have to accept there is a degree of risk. It's not going to be less than 100%. And I agree with you that science can inform our thinking. However, the risk is currently unknown. Let's let this continue, let a bit of the research and get a bit more data so that opening is a known risk. Frankly, as far as I'm concerned, this academic year is done. I'd love to go back to school. I miss it, but let's accept this year is done. The exams are all graded on a curve anyway, so the effects will be elsewhere. And let's invest, like we're investing in propping up businesses, in making really, really good online education for the rest of this year. We can't go back with safe social distancing. We don't know. They might be safe for the kids. It might be safe for some of the teachers, but we don't know who the kids might be bringing that the virus home to as asymptomatic carriers. as far as I'm concerned, just reopening now would be irresponsible, because actually, whilst we don't have to do exactly, because what the interpretation of the science is up for question, but we don't know what the science is. As a scientist, as a physics teacher, I say, stay closed for a while.
Okay, thank you. Shall we have a view from Australia? I think Gail Reed is in Australia. What would you like to tell us about?
Yes, well, about the social distancing, that was always a sticking point about getting our schools open again. The argument was, well, you can't social distance in a school, and that's true. You can't social distance in a school. So thankfully, our Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, made a public announcement about 2 weeks ago and said social distancing in classrooms is not required. There's no evidence that the virus is passed on from children to teachers. Teachers need to do some distancing in the staff room. So we have our meetings via, we don't use Zoom, we use WebEx. We're back at school. It's all honky-dory. Kids are settled. Teachers are happy. We've got about 75% of kids back at the moment. And this is we've only been back for 4 days, and we're expecting a lot more in the coming weeks. So really happy to be able to report that. And about the principals, Joanna's point about principals having a say. Well, our principals work under the direction of the government. And if the government says, get back to school, open schools up, that's how it happens. And principals don't have a say, and I don't think they should have a say in schools, whether or not schools should be open. I think the government makes a decision, and we carry it out. Now, with the independent schools, they are able to make some decisions around school openings, but what happens is the government will maybe incentivize them by saying, well, we'll give you some funding in advance. Yeah. Anyway, so that's it for me. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Gail. Thanks. Can we come to Alka, Sehgal, Cuthbert, please?
Okay, thank you. Oh, thank you. You've unmuted me. Well, I think I agree probably more with Dave actually overall on this, because I think I think you're really right. The educational project was over well before this, and it is, and although it is good to hear from some quarters the case is being made to open schools for educational reasons, which I know is what you're saying, Joe, but the majority of reasons that are being given is kind of bemoaning the fact that teachers aren't there to keep an eye on the potentially abusive abused kids, or to do their jobs as social workers. So there's a mixture of different reasons, and I think probably it is quite important reasons are important as well. So to push the educational ones would be good. But I'm not sure. I'm genuinely not quite sure. I'm much more, I don't feel hesitant about schools opening in one sense. It's not so much the fear of contagion, because I agree with the points you've made and that have been made widely, that we don't know, the scientists don't know. So we have to decide, do we want to live our lives and our social lives only when we know for certainty, or when is the known risk, as John, I think, said earlier. So, but what does worry me is that this, as Dave said, that this is just not being thought through properly. I think it's being actually too politicised really at the moment. You think about if we start opening, but you leave it, if you say, Joanna, it sounds good to say, yes, the presumption should be all schools open, but then with individual choice. But what will that look like in practice? What will that mean for some schools, for some year 10s or year 12s, who some will be having exams, some will be having education, others won't? At the minute, you've got a cohort of people who haven't sat their A-levels, their grades are being worked out, but they've not heard yet from universities as to what that transition from, what they're going to accept, and whether, people coming back to do resits, how that's going to work out. So, and there'll be a group, there could be a group of kids who don't have any exam experience at all if they miss out on their GCSEs. So I think, to me, it seems sensible to go for perhaps to say something like reopen in September, but go flat out over summer to have all the different people involved, the exam boards, the universities and the schools and the politicians, to work out something that, you know, or some possible options that can be more publicly discussed.
Thank you, Alka. Okay, I'm going to take a couple more and then I'll bring back Joanna and David. Shall we have Ian next? Ian, are you there?
Yes, yes. Thank you. Thanks to the speakers. I can't believe you're not showing me your bookshelves tonight. On the point about courage, that was in Joanna's original headline, that teachers should show courage. And a lot of the comments on Twitter said, well, it's not about courage because it's really about whether the government have closed the schools, whether they open them up or not. But I started to get into conversations with teachers on Twitter about this, and particularly NEU representatives, and just simply asked, okay, so if the government said you're going back to school and the scientists said it's time to open the schools, would you back that? And they said, well, no, only if it's safe, only if it's safe. So actually it's a bit disingenuous to claim that if the government say, oh yes, we're opening them up again, that it's not about that in the first place. I think one of the big sticking points here will be the unions. I think they're going to fight this, and I think they're going to fight it on the grounds of safety of their employees. And coming back to the article, it did point out that so many other workers around the country, bus drivers, just for one example, have gone through they've been at work and they have taken that risk, if you like. Maybe they didn't want to, but they've done it. And I think that's something that teachers should maybe think about as well, that should we be trying to match the attitude of other workers in the public sector and service sector and so on. Thank you.
Good point. All right, yeah, thank you. Rick Moore. Rick Moore. Are you there, Rick? Hello? Yes, we can't hear you. Need unmuting.
Hello, is that better?
That's it. Yeah, you're fine. Okay.
Right.
Go ahead.
I mean, I've got kids that are at primary school. My wife works in a school, and I'm honestly in two minds about whether or not schools should go back. But one of the things I'm kind of keeping in mind with this is it's not just all about education. For the kids, they learn an awful lot of life skills, interacting with the friends, with the teachers, that at home it just isn't the same to be able to generate. So I think we need to keep in mind that kids do need that space to grow and to develop that they just can't get at home. So I think overall, even though, like I say, I'm in two minds about it, I think really we do need to get the schools back open as soon as we can.
Okay, thank you. Right, I'm going to come back to, I think, Dave first and then Joanna. But we seem to have a lot of contributions here which are broadly speaking in favour of going back. But are there some issues that you'd like to pick up on there? Dave first, please.
I think the thing about courage is a really interesting one, actually, because I get exactly the point as to why Joanna raised it and why it's been brought up in relation to this. Because I think the union's reaction to this, and it's not just in teaching, it's across the board, is paralysing, and using the idea of health and safety and risk. And can we be sure that there is no risk? Well, no, you can't. That's it. Finished. End of discussion. So what are you going to do? And so it's not on the basis of risk that we resolve this. It's something else. And I think that's really damaging. It's got people into a mess. But on courage, I mean, when we went down, we immediately, before it was even asked, said, right, we're going to provide some capacity for parents who've got kids and their health workers and all the rest of it, or they've got kids they literally can't cope with at home. And we did that straight off, and we did it, and you said, right, we can't force people to do it, just ask for volunteers. And we've never shut, not since the whole thing started, we never shut. We worked right through Easter, that's the holiday, You know, traditionally teachers don't do anything during holidays; they just run off, or that's what people think. No, they all volunteered. They kept it going. We're still going now, and we will not shut. Bank holiday will be open because we're committed to looking after kids we've got, and in the circumstances where we know that there was a risk. I don't think there is now, but there was a very strong risk, and people did go down ill whilst they were doing that, but they took it. That, I think, has been huge for our staff, and I think so. There's not one answer to this. So when I say unions, I don't mean if you're unionised, you follow that along. You don't have to. You can think about it differently. But it's really difficult if major institutions like the unions are sort of arguing this in a destructive way, and I think that needs to be called out.
Okay, Joanna.
So just to clarify, I'm absolutely under no illusions whatsoever that the project of education, that the promotion of knowledge was all kind of fine and dandy in the world prior to coronavirus. It absolutely wasn't. And I think it's precisely because the project of education had been so called into question, so degraded, that it was so easy to close schools en masse and to cancel GCSE exams and to cancel A-level exams. You know, it appeared, certainly to me as an outsider to these government processes, that that was a decision that was taken in one afternoon after the pressure for lockdown became too much. Well, we'll shut the schools. I think it's also the degradation of education is also abundantly apparent in what Dave and Alka both said about how all the arguments for reopening schools seem to focus around welfare, mental health problems, children with free school meals, children who are facing abuse, children who are witnessing domestic violence, etc., etc., and actually making an educational case for getting children back into the classroom. That's been few and far between. But that's not a good reason for saying, well, we should have shut schools in the first place, or we should keep schools shut now until September, because that's just kind of adding to the degradation. It's just saying, well, we've not got any good reasons for keeping schools open, so we'll just carry on and shut them. I mean, I think you do need to look at this from an educational perspective. And I think, you know, I can't remember, it wasn't Lauren, but whoever sits alongside Lauren was saying, you know, there's things that we don't know about coronavirus, and that's certainly true. But there are things we do know about it. And we also do know some of the problems of not having children in school. We know, for example, I think pretty much everybody who I've spoken to and read on this says that no matter how brilliant the tech is, no matter how whizzy the Zoom lessons are, no matter how rigid the Microsoft Teams timetable is, no matter how much effort's put into online learning, it can never replace the interaction of a teacher in the classroom. You know, it just can't. And that's not in any way meant to denigrate the efforts that teachers have been putting in over the past few weeks and months. You know, this is just a fact. If we want education to continue in a meaningful sense, we need schools to reopen. But I think the points that Rick was making are actually really important as well. Schools are social institutions. They're social institutions with the main project of education. And that does, in that social institution comes discipline, comes interaction, comes learning about yourself from being alongside other people. So that's why I think we can't open schools, you know, be pointless to open schools with social distancing in place. But I think Dave and I are perhaps in agreement on that. Just on why I'm saying there should be a presumption of schools being open, even if that means, and I would see relatively few now, schools needing to close. But I think it means that you have to justify you have to justify closing your school rather than justify opening it, and that the onus is then on the school to the closure to be kept to a minimum. I don't think closing all schools somehow promotes educational equality. I mean, if it does promote equality, it's a lowest common denominator equality. It seems to me that what we've got going on at the moment is the very opposite of educational equality. We have more inequality in terms of access to lessons. You know, this has been very well highlighted, many of the inequalities that are really being exacerbated with the current system. And I think the danger is this will continue if we're not careful. You can see that some schools are already gearing up so that when there is an eventual return in September. The main focus will be on mental health, encouraging children to learn about how to make friends again, as if that's something you can learn in theory in the classroom, teaching children how to interact with one another, whereas some schools will be saying, right, this is the curriculum, we better get on with it. So I don't think closing schools on the grounds of equality is a good argument.
Okay,
Can
thanks,
I just
Joanna. Yeah, Dave, you can come back in. Yeah, both barrels there, Joanna.
I think there's a couple of points. Someone made the point in the chat. Just lauding private schools for giving online lessons all day misses the point that if they don't do that, no one's going to pay the fees. So just be a bit careful. I think they're absolutely scared stiff that this is going to destroy them. Like everybody else in society, this is having a really damaging effect on private schools. So it's not what you think it is.
But it doesn't mean to say they're not receiving lessons. I mean, we can question the motives. We can question why are they doing this.
Hang on. Let me speak. Thank you. Right, so they're chucking work out by the bucket full. I know, because I've got a son at one. But that's the way they're justifying their fees, which people have to pay when they can't get into the school. Right, so that's one thing.
All right, point made, Dave. I want to bring some more people in. I've got a Jay Hussey here, please.
Hello.
Hi.
Okay. I just wanted to talk about the fact that I think it's a problem of leadership, because I think just on the points that other people have made, I do think the children's engagement is fading and will fade online, and I think that's a danger that we have to think about. I also, on the question of safety of staff, every year I've watched children go through flu jabs and the teachers don't get them free. We have to go and pay for them at the doctors if we decide we're at risk. So it's the first time they've really worried about the teacher's health, which is interesting. But I think on the leadership question, I think there's three layers. I think there's the level of politics, and political decisions should be made on the basis of judging the science and everything else that politics involves to run our society. I think the teachers, their leadership role is, at the moment, they're seeing it very technically. And so they're writing lists and checking social distancing, how they could do that, cancel assemblies, how we're going to do lunch. Whereas I think their responsibility is to think about the education and to think, well, you know, how are we going to get year 10 and year 12 ready for GCSEs and A-levels? How are we going to get the reception children transitioned into school? How are we going to transition year 6s into ready for year 7? And I think then there's a leadership, not a leadership issue, but an issue for parents, because there's a responsibility there too. And I think the parents' responsibility is a moral one. Do I decide, okay, society has said it's time to go back to school, I'm going to go with that and take that risk? Or am I going to opt out individually, you know, in the way that, and I think all these strands have been going for a long time. Schools have become too safeguarding conscious, politicians are too reactive, and parents are becoming quite individuated and deciding whether or not to have an injection, or, you know, and opting out of various things. And I think, so everybody at the different layers has to take some responsibility.
Thank you. We've got James Leech. Is James there, please?
Do I need to unmute myself? Yeah,
no, you're done.
From my perspective, can you hear me?
Yeah.
From my perspective, we're parents of 2 secondary age children. Looking at what's important here is in terms of if schools were to open, what would worry me, we're very much of the school of thought, excuse the pun, that our kids should go back. But the parent buy-in might be quite weak. I think too much is made in the main. I think this is the fault of mainstream media and the government in terms of very much focusing people on the risks of COVID-19 alone, without talking more about the risks of resulting from the lockdown. So what I would say when we talk to our kids, we're going to say to them, you know, yes, fine, there is a risk of infection as there is with any other disease, but alongside that, you've got the risks of, you know, mental health if children aren't having physical contact with their friends. You've got the economic damage. Parents aren't able to go back to work because they have to look after their kids still. There's all kinds of other things that will result as an impact of the lockdown itself. So, yeah, so I think then the government and certainly a lot of the national papers and media need to make more of a case that's balanced, that actually outlines the risks, not only of COVID-19 infection and so forth, but also of the lockdown itself.
Thank you. Can we have Andrea Seaman now? Andrea? No, Andrea?
Yes, right. Well,
Okay.
I think certain issues have come up again, which have been dealt in the past with. I remember in 2008, when I was a school kid in Switzerland, the bird flu was current among society, and there was a great panic about it. And in the bird flu sort of feared epidemic, we did trust children in Switzerland to respect certain rules. So, for example, our teacher refused to shake our hands. And I remember this especially because I was the only one who ever insisted upon shaking his hand. And I got quite upset when he refused to shake my hand anymore. And certain things were posted, you know, on walls next to the washing basin where you washed your hands, how to wash your hands properly. So in the past, we did not shut down schools from fear of an epidemic. Instead, we were very rationally based, trying to trust children and teachers to negotiate a situation for themselves. And I think an important point to make is also that there could have been measures could have been put in place which protected both children and teachers. For example, teachers, as teachers, should be in the front of the classroom, away from the children, teaching from the front to the children who sit in front of the teacher. So that wouldn't have been too much of a problem. And I think perhaps, I mean, in Switzerland now, you have a lot of children sitting at home, doing Zoom with their teachers or other certain Skype modules and things like that, and worksheets and things like that. But the one resource which is opened up for children right now is time. And the problem with education before the coronavirus epidemic was that it wasn't too academic. So my suggestion would have been that in the time that children have now to spend on education, the teachers should have mandated a certain list of books which in the time which children have, they should be able to read. And then a test should be set on the books which the teachers mandated. So I think we could have actually used this coronavirus epidemic and the children self-isolating at home in a positive way for education to actually increase standards and our demands on the intellectual capacities of children.
Thank you, Andrea. Can I come to Jennie Bristow now, please? Jennie, are you there?
Yes, hi. I've got a quick thing, and then Emma's got a quick thing as well. It's really tricky, the kind of practicalities of it. I think it's great to have teased out how sort of tricky they are. I mean, I suppose the way I've got to thinking about it is that I sort of don't, I don't really care what happens in terms of, you know, the work that gets done when people go back to school now. I think what has really bothered me is the moral and symbolic effect of not the closing schools just before Easter, which I think, you know, didn't agree with, but there was a kind of reason for. But it's a sort of, it's like a very clear message is being given that it doesn't matter. And I think that kind of message is coming through to young people quite strongly, that, you know, actually it's sort of less significant. They're at the bottom of the pecking order now in terms of, you know, what matters with them and their education. And this sense of young people being kept away because, you know, society is scared of them. And I think this is almost like I want to make an argument for the school as the interface between adult society and the child world, and to say that's what's missing, and that's what you can never bring back through the more individuated online teaching and learning. And Emma, what did you want to say?
I just wanted to say, like, the problem, the main thing is that you can see, and I can see that slowly the people are just people are just slowly fading. Like, they can't escape from like their everyday lives, and especially I'm in year 11, so we've had our like exams cancelled, like we don't have any focus, any drive, and that's what's been taken away from us. And like putting stuff online is not going to give us the drive anymore. So even if people are getting set work, which we're not really, is they don't have any motivation to do it because they don't see the point, because it was a rash decision that they just took away the purpose of our education, really, like out of our hands.
Thank you. All right. I'm just going to take one more and then I'll come back to Joanna and Dave. Have we got, is Noah Keats there?
Just a few points from me. I wanted to know that if schools do eventually reopen, do David and Joanna think that parents who might have underlying health issues, should they be sanctioned if they decide to keep their children at home because of the fear and the worry about the disease potentially being passed on to them outside the school gates? I also wanted to know, just on a practical basis, whether there are any laws regarding a certain ratio of teaching staff to students in schools. I don't know if that's the case, and if it is the case, then how would that affect going back if you had teachers that had underlying health issues? And finally, how can schools mitigate for the inevitable inequalities that exist in terms of access towards online learning, and whether children do or don't have spaces to work in their homes? Because clearly if children haven't been able to, they haven't got the internet access, they're not going to be motivated to work. So what can schools do to sort of foster an appreciation and a love for learning when they do eventually reopen? Thank you very much.
Okay, well, we've got quite a lot there. One way or another. Dave, what's your response, please?
Yeah, I think the way that kids are taking this is really fascinating and sort of difficult. So I'm year 11, year 13. I hate to say this, but there's nothing we can do now because the system has shut them out. If you're not aware of it, they're not allowed to do any work because that would be in effect cheating, to do with the way that the GCSE and A-level grades are going to be manufactured. So it's a really strange system. In other words, in order to protect the examination system because of what's happened, they can't have any relationship with the school, which is bizarre. So they're really lost and don't know what to do. But I'm more worried, and no disrespect to those kids, but I'm more worried with the ones who are 1 year off. They have no vision on the future at all. They think it's all gone. I mean, I can't tell you the way they express it because it's very rude, but they think they haven't got a future. It's finished, okay? And it doesn't matter what anyone says, that we have to rebuild that confidence with them, that we mean it, and we do. But my God, it's a hard battle to win, because it looks like society is saying to them, well, you know, either your GCSEs are going to be put off for a year, or we're going to get you into school when everybody else is out, so we can ram you through the exam system because that's what matters, i.e. it's not you, it's the exam system, and you're just going to go through the machine. Their attitude to this, unless they're really well looked after, is going to be disastrous. It's a generation, you know, switched off from education. So in that sense, I do agree with what Jonathan pointed to.
Can I just start?
Yeah, go on.
Sorry, carry on.
No, you.
Well, I was just going to ask you, Dave, about parents, really, and the extent to which, what's your take on the parents in kids in your school, and generally speaking, what sort of role do you think parents should be having in the decision making?
Well, I mean, if you mean whether they should send their kids back or not, I mean, I'm not going to argue with them in terms of this, because I mean, they have gone through hell and back trying to work out what's going on, and I think someone pointed out, and scared rigid by the fact that nobody's really being clear about what the risks are and all the rest of it. They've got to work it out themselves, and you know, their experiences are pretty horrific where I live. But actually, they're really positive about everything we're doing, right? They haven't lost it with us or walked away. They're really pleased that we're helping them. One reason is we keep their kids busy, but you know, because that is a thing. But also they can see that we mean it with the education. In fact, and this is something I would like to say, I am not totally against online learning, right? Because actually it's allowed us to do things we haven't been able to do before and get actually a tighter understanding to some extent of what we're about. Is it replacing teaching? No, of course not. Absolutely not. But we're not letting go of it when we come back. So for us, it's added something to us that we can do with kids. The one thing they say to us at the minute for my school is, my God, can't you stop giving us work? It's more than we had when we were at school.
Yeah.
Right answer.
Yeah. Okay. Joanna, what would you like to come back on of those comments previously?
So I think the point that Dave makes there about the year 11s and the year 13s and teachers actually being forbidden, if you like, for want of a better word, for teaching because of disturbing their kind of exam results or predicted grades that they'll get given at this stage. I think, you know, I'm not going to contradict you there for a second, Dave, but I think it just really illustrates the very ruthless and horrible nature of what's gone on over the past few months. And for me, it illustrates absolutely 100% why schools should not have closed in the first place. And it is this idea of sending out a message to a generation of young kids: we've washed our hands of you. Not only have we washed our hands of you, but we now give up on educating you, essentially. We don't see any point. You're not doing the exam, so there's no point in us carrying on bothering. We want nothing to do with you, in effect. And I think that's a really hard lesson to give to 15-year-olds and to 17-year-olds. Like I said, I think for me, that really sums up why schools shouldn't have closed. But just to come back to some of the other points that people were making, I think it was Jo was saying about leadership, and I think that's such an important point, and particularly the point that she was making about how so many teachers and head teachers, I'm sure not you, Dave, but other head teachers see leadership in a very, very technical way. And again, I think that's another example that comes across both whether education's being done online and in the home, or whether it's being done in the classroom. You see it becomes a real technical issue. You know, what platform are we going to use? It's not the problem that Andrea raises, which I really, really wish people were talking about. What 10 books would we really love all 13-year-olds in the country to have read by September? Nobody's talking about that. I really wish they were. Instead, it's technical issues. Do people have internet access? What platform can we use? You know, what's the correct length for an online lesson? And exactly the same if it's a question of restarting schools. You know, people compiling intricate maps of a classroom to try and prove that they couldn't get more than 4 children in a classroom at one time if they all have to keep 2 meters radius around each other. And I think, you know, that technical discussion again comes back to this degraded view of education. I think perhaps what coronavirus really brings to light, partly it is just how degraded our view of education has become, but it's also how problematic our view of children is. One of the things that's upset me most in the discussions that have gone on in the past few weeks is this idea that children become reduced to the status of virus spreaders. You know, they become this kind of ball of infection that's going to contaminate everyone they come into contact with. And again, you get this kind of technical idea that they are then a problem to be managed as how do we manage these virus spreaders who are going to contaminate us, and children become perceived as a risk and a problem to be managed. And you know, I think that's a hugely dangerous way for us to be perceiving what's essentially going to be the next generation of young people in this country. Just on the issue of parents keeping children at home, just very quickly on that, you know, I said it in my opening comments about the importance of judgment, and I would extend that to parents as well. You know, totally, if I was having chemotherapy at this point in time, I would be anxious about sending my child to school, and I would probably make the decision not to, at least not until September, or, you know, not until I had more evidence that it was safe. If I had a child who was suffering from leukemia, or, you know, and had suffered from leukemia, you know, likewise, I'd be making these decisions. And I don't think parents should be penalized for making those decisions. But, and I can't remember, I think this is the point that James was making. I think the problem at the moment is that we've had so much of a society-wide panic and fear about coronavirus and coronavirus in relation to children, and this issue of children as virus spreaders, that it's not going to be the odd parent who's undergoing chemotherapy, the odd child who's had leukemia. You know, the danger is that we have much larger groups of parents and children because of this very, very heightened perception of risk that people are perhaps understandably perceiving, making that judgment to keep their children away. And you know, the problem is if you have so many teachers and so many parents and children deciding, no, we're not going to do this, then you can't. No matter what government says, no matter what a head teacher might say, the school can't function. We need to have enough people prepared to show courage and take a risk and actually get back into school because they think it's worthwhile, because this is something important that we want to do.
Okay, thank you very much. Can I come to Claire Fox now, please? Claire.
Thanks. This is an excellent discussion, by the way, very thought-provoking. I wanted to just say that I don't think this is like the bird flu. I think it's a proper pandemic, and I think it's understandable that extraordinary measures have been taken. I'm not as much of a lockdown skeptic as maybe some people, and I understand why that happened. What really shocked me about schools, though, was that there was, despite a clamour for schools to close down, there was not actually a government decision to close down schools, even based on the science. But the clamour actually came from teachers themselves. And I can understand what Dave said about if the school was in a state of collapse or people were ill and the leadership team were all ill, that's one thing. But there was an absolute demand by teachers that they shouldn't have to be on the front line. And they wanted to go down, and they wanted to close the schools down. And so the irony there was, I actually thought that the schools would close down, but they didn't. Nobody thought they should close down as early as they did in official circles or amongst scientists. No advice was suggesting that, but there was a demand from teachers that they close down. And I thought that was nerve-wracking because first of all, there's a lot of workers in this country who've had no choice but to carry on. I mean, I'm rather glad that health workers didn't have the same clamour and refused to go on the front line. I'm rather glad, as it happens, that the people who pick up the bins and the people who work in Tesco's also have not decided to down tools. Because I think in that sense, that kind of sense that we're public facing, how dare you demand that we carry on, has been exasperating. It's also the case that I was actually aggrieved on Joanna's behalf, even though I might have not expressed I didn't necessarily agree with everything in her article, but the treatment of her was, how dare you criticise us teachers when we're sacrificing our health in order to carry on and we're hard done to. And it came over as a real victim mentality. And the reason I'm raising that is because it seemed to me that what was lost there was a sense of this being an important public service role. You know, this is public service, vocational. And we are constantly being told, by the way, I used to teach in further education, but we're constantly told by contemporary teachers that they are the most important people in the world. They are saving the whole of society, that they're solving the problem of social mobility, that they are key to every single thing that ever happens in society. And suddenly they think they're not that important, and that actually that they should not have to risk anything. So on the leadership point, I think that's really key. Just very quickly, on Rick's point, which I thought was really excellent, when he said, you know, I'm a great knowledge for its own sake, supporter of academic education, the importance of that being the primary function of schooling and teaching. But there is more to schools than that. There is a socialisation process. And I think Rick was right to draw attention to what's being lost. If teachers think that it's okay to substitute online teaching with what is your life as a young person, which is effectively going to school and learning how to be independent and live a life and critical thinkers, that they just think that that's dispensable with for months and months on end on the basis of their own safety. That seemed to me to be a terrible lesson of leadership. And when Emma spoke about what it feels like to be a year 11 or 12, sorry, Emma, I can't remember, student who just feels abandoned, you know, just with no purpose. You know, I don't think it's going to be a mental health crisis, but if there's an existential crisis to be had, we are handing it to those young people by teachers themselves. So in that sense, not courage physically, but it does seem to me that teachers are not showing leadership. Now, of course, there's loads of teachers here loads of my mates are teachers, not all teachers, but the official teacher line and the teachers who in their thousands abused Joe for going against the norm, it struck me were not a good example of a brave profession, brave morally, not physically, prepared to take a lead to young people to show what it might take to be a responsible citizen in contemporary society. And don't get me wrong, it's bloody scary out there. This is not some minor little flu thing. This is a major problem. And I understand physical fear, but it's just that you would want there to be something of a moral leadership that would at least indicate that they were prepared at some point to take the reins in their hands and give a lead. And I think that's been missing.
Thank you. Thanks, Claire. All right, we've got, I'm going to take Annette, and then I've got a question to ask on behalf of someone, and then if Joanna and Dave respond. So Annette.
Hello.
Hello, Annette.
Can you hear me?
Yes, can hear you.
Just Claire's points there were very interesting. A view from Scotland. First of all, in response to what she said there, one of my colleagues who was wanting to keep his school open was told by John Swinney in Scotland that he was not allowed to have senior pupils in working. So it was not that teachers weren't wanting to work. It came from the Scottish government, admittedly. But the point really that I wanted to make most was for the young people concerned. Now, I have recently retired after a long time teaching. I was continuing to do some supply teaching. But speaking to the young people with whom I am still in contact, mainly pupils who did debating and things like that with me, they are really, really struggling at not being in school. They're bright young people. They're finding life really difficult that they're not being able to be in schools and mixing with people. And equally, I'm aware at the other end of the scale, as somebody who's a year ahead, I'm aware that there will be a lot of young people who will be equivalent to year 11, my year group was, and they'll not be doing anything. Their parents will not be able to make them work. They won't want to work, and they will be getting further and further behind. And my last point very quickly was the lady in Australia that spoke seemed to suggest that it was possible to get children back to school without too much trauma. Is there anything we can learn from there? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. All right, now I've got a question here for the two of you. Could you ask the two contributors how long they think teachers can be paid their salary if schools do stay closed? Say until September? All right, well, that's a question for you both. Answer or not? Joanna.
So just briefly on that, I mean, I totally agree with the points that Claire was making around moral leadership. And I do think this is a really important point going forward, because I think at some point, you know, who knows when, but at some point schools will reopen. At some point there will be a normality. And I guess it's up to us, to every single one of us, whether this is going to be a new normal or the old normal or a better normal, what kind of world it is that we're going to live in the future, what education is going to look like and what schools are going to look like. But I think the more teachers and all of us are kind of approaching the future with a moral courage, with a determination, with an important kind of sense of priorities, with the goal of education, I would like to see being very high up that list of priorities, then I think the better it will be for young people and the more resilient they will be able to come out of this. I think the more, when we return to schools, the more we give children the message that that was the most traumatic thing ever and they're never going to recover from this. And, you know, teachers as well have kind of had a complete confidence crisis. You know, it kind of doesn't inspire children to face the future in a brave and resilient manner. And I think it's really important that we do try to present, to act as role models for young people, as people with moral courage and the ability to exercise leadership ourselves. And I think children will pick up on that spirit if we can show it ourselves. Sorry, I can't really remember the other questions about paid. I mean, not in my job description, I'm afraid, to answer that question. I mean, how deep are Rishi Sunak's pockets? I think we're finding out with every passing day that his pockets are deeper and deeper. I mean, 3 trillion. We found out this morning are the size of Trump's pockets, and he seems to be able to there seems to be no limit at the moment to the amount of money that can be printed. So yeah, who knows? Could go on for a long, long time. I don't think money will be the #1 object there. I think, sorry, one final thing on that though. I do think, and this is perhaps me being a little bit cheeky now, and this is absolutely not directed at all teachers, but directed at a few teachers who've had quite a great deal of contact with me to send me nasty messages. I do think some teachers perhaps need to remember where their pay packets do come from. And I think, you know, ultimately teachers' pay comes from taxpayers and school funding comes from taxpayers. And if we do close down the economy entirely and we don't have people in work, then ultimately there is less revenue going into the government's finances. And so for the next round of teacher pay rises, for the next increase in school funding, that money won't be there. And I think the way some teachers carry on, there is a kind of magic money tree where this is coming from, and everyone can stay out of work forever and ever and ever, and teachers will continue to take home salaries and be able to make the case for pay rises. Well, unfortunately, that's not the real world.
Okay, food for thought there. Dave, what have you got to say?
You shouldn't ask me about paying teachers because I'm in charge of the budget. So if I've got an excuse not to pay.
All right, okay.
It's like, okay, but because but the point is, the pressure on us financially as a school and all schools is massive. You just can't see it at the moment. But when we get past this into a position where people are going to tell us how much money schools are going to get, it's going to hurt like hell. And if it didn't, we wouldn't be living in the real world, would we? Because we've just lost a huge amount of income. And that's one end. And then the other end is that parents who won't have jobs very shortly, because a massive amount of people are going to find out their jobs are going to disappear very shortly when furlough finishes. But at least that's the way it looks at the minute. And then what do we do? So it's not that way. It's like we're heading for a massive mess that we're all going to have to struggle through. And so to pretend that we shouldn't come back because we want absolutely certain that it's safe is just nonsense. What is sure is it won't be safe, because there won't be anything to be safe to go back to if we carry on this way. It's just crazy. So I just wanted to take up one thing that Joanne's been pushing quite hard throughout this, and that's the fact that if we do lockdown, we're necessarily going to mess up the education system. I don't think that's necessary at all, as it happens. I think that if we have to, take a measure because we think that's the way to protect people in the short term, that does not mean that we have to mess up education. Right? That they're two separate things. What you practically have to do doesn't tell you that your value system is kaput. The truth is, the value system is gone anyway, and I think we agree on that. And therefore, it's not lockdown that causes that. It exposes it amazingly, but it exposes everything in society at the moment in terms of our values. So what we need to do now, more than ever, is fight for education, for an education that's worth having. That's what we need to do. And that's what we do as a teacher, dealing with the kids online now, and in terms of what we fight for in terms of when we come back and how we see education going. That's the discussion that this group can really take on board. And just do very simple little things like, if I tell you what I've been doing in the last couple of weeks, I've been teaching Kant, Immanuel Kant, I've been teaching Java code, I've been doing Shakespeare, I've been doing obviously physics because that's my thing, GCSE astronomy, how many of you know any school that does that? I could go on, right? So, and we're doing that even though we're shut, formally shut, and we're not going to stop. That, if you do that way, then you're talking about a completely different situation. Why are we doing this and other people not? That's because we haven't won the battle of ideas about how we should view education. That's it. Win that, and it doesn't matter. We can get through this.
Good point. Thanks, Dave. Can I bring in Teach Smith now, please?
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So I had lots of things to say, but I just thought I would be positive. I agree for some reason that nationally There seems to be a movement of teachers to stay within their homes, and it's deeply disappointing to me as a secondary school English teacher. I would love to get back, and I'm just going to present a case, perhaps. I would love for tomorrow the government to announce that schools go back after May half term. That would give schools a few weeks to prep teachers, prep parents. I would like to think after May half term for teachers to say, we're here, come along if you can, to show up every day, teach our best lessons, to encourage parents to bring their kids along, to gently nudge those who we think should be in school but are not, and obviously to give compassion to those who need to shield, and to do that up to summer holidays. And then in September, everyone's in school, everyone's back, so that in those last 6-7 weeks, we can build the culture back up again, get people slowly coming back, slowly realizing what a great thing school is. Now, I understand I might be in the minority as a teacher, having that view, and I think it does link back to what Dave said about the battle for education itself, and it links into what someone else said about giving them some books to read. If there was such an academic culture in this country, then we wouldn't even need online teaching as such for a short period anyway. We'd just say, go read some books and talk to me about them, you know, and we could comment back and forth, and it would, if it became extended, then we'd have to do something else, but it links more to an academic culture, I think. So I just want to put it out there that there are teachers out there like myself who would love to go back to school after May half term, because I think we need time to get people used to the idea. I'll turn up, I'll be there, I'll be ready to teach A Christmas Carol, you know, to my year 10s and everything else. But you're right that it speaks to a hollowing out of the profession. That is the real issue. The hollowing out leads to technocratic decisions, and the hollowing out leads to a lack of rigor on both sides. And it's sad.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, can I bring in Jennie Cunningham now, please? Jennie?
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I meant to come in a bit earlier, so this might be a bit redundant, but certainly just one point about parents. In Scotland, it's a very middle class thing, I think, for parents to be worried about sending their children back to school. Certainly most of the working class commentators and people who are doing work at the moment are frantic to get their children back to school, and very well aware that they're falling behind seriously. Many schools in Scotland are not providing any kind of online or any kind of teaching anyway. But the point I wanted to come in on was the sort of question of leadership. I mean, as someone completely outside of education, wondering what avenues you have to challenge some of this risk business, quite apart from the educational issues, which I understand are vast. It's this whole risk thing, and it is disgusting the way the unions seem to be making that the key issue. I mean, there's a lot of information challenging the government scientists at the moment, particularly as far as children are concerned. And there's a very strong argument, in fact, that the more children are exposed to coronavirus, the more attenuated the virus is actually going to become. It's part of the whole idea of herd immunity, that viruses generally, particularly these big viruses, actually the wider they spread, the more attenuated they become, the less virulent they become. And that's precisely why viral infections, even the most serious ones, do actually eventually come under control, because fewer and fewer people are actually getting the more virulent form. So, I mean, there are plenty of arguments against risk. I'm just wondering, what are the avenues that teachers have to actually challenge some of those ideas, just at the level of risk? I know there's a much bigger fight to be had in terms of you know, fighting for a decent education.
Thank you, Jenny. That's a really interesting contribution. Something sort of, as you said, from outside the education world, but some important insights there. I've got a few more people I'm going to take, and then I'm going to bring Joanna and Dave to make their final comments. Okay, so let's have Connor McCrory next, please. Connor.
Yeah. I'm a science teacher and a union rep in Hackney, the third worst affected borough in terms of per capita death rates. So just with two different hats on, with my union rep hat on, you know, there's a lot of union bashing, bizarrely a lot of teacher bashing, even though there are some teachers in the group. Our schools have not been closed. 70% of schools have been open in some form or another. I've been in every week on a voluntary rota with the support of my union. The union has supported voluntary rotas being in place to provide some form of education to the best of our ability for vulnerable students, students of key workers, etc. So I've been in there every week since the shutdown. Now, I supported the partial shutdown of schools, but I also, not being in a vulnerable group, not having dependents, not living with vulnerable relatives, was one of the person who was willing to take that risk and go in every week on a voluntary rota to work with kids, you know, in a suitable situation. So in terms of this notion that teachers aren't brave, but transport workers and NHS workers are, in terms of the acceptance of physical risk, some of us have been going in. In terms of transport workers, it took 12 transport workers to die, and certainly in London, in London it took 12 transport workers to die, and, you know, fierce pushing from their union to get any safety measures put in place on buses. Bus drivers were reporting that they were terrified to go into work. Now they put some safety measures in place, but it took about 3 weeks into the sort of substantial change in society that we'd seen. In terms of the NHS workers called for us to stay at home. NHS workers have just written an open letter saying that they are also extremely concerned about us going back to school. Their message was the way that we could take the stress off them and enable them to go to work at all would be to decrease the risk in a surge capacity. And that was by doing whatever we could to not have as much movement through society. So NHS workers actually called and supported teachers in staying at home where they could. Now, is it adequate in terms of providing education? No, we're in very different times, and I share the concerns of Joanna and David in that respect. With my scientist hat on as a science teacher, what are we learning? I sort of welcome Marcus's comment early on. You can shut me up in a minute if I'm going on too long. But I welcome Marcus's comment earlier. Every day, more and more research is coming in, and I accept what Joanna said. Science does not determine values. I utterly accept that some form of moral and political judgment and will have to be made in this case. But what are we finding? The German team just found that the viral loads of children are as high as any other group, albeit they do not display the same symptoms. A team in China looking at patients in a COVID ward found that people in all age groups were susceptible to it. Again, less so in kids. Other research from France in February, which has just been published in a preprint, has found that in a cohort study, the viral loads in children were just as high as in adults. Again, they had less symptoms, but they have high viral loads. Other research in the journal Pediatrics in the last 2 weeks has found that fecal shedding is an issue, and that the virus particles were found in feces of children. So this is something that we have to bear in mind when we consider these things. So yes, we don't know, it's not all settled, but the more research comes in, it does say that children are, first of all, they're susceptible, they do shed the virus, albeit in smaller amounts, but some of the concerns are that they make up for it in the amount of social contact that they make. And that's something I think that's worth bearing in mind. I don't think that that's scary or hocus pocus. 32,000 people have died in the last 2 months, and that's with 6 weeks of extreme measures in place. What would it have been like if we didn't do it? I dread to think what that would have happened.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Connor. Thanks. Okay, can we have, let me see. Sorry, Richard Wolfenden next.
Thank you. If you saw on the news this evening, the airlines some of the airlines who find it impossible to socially distance are just forcing it. Do we need to do that as schools? Does taking moral leadership mean that we actually, as schools, on an individual school basis, have to say, right, we're making a decision, we will talk to our parents, now is the right time to go back, if the government really sort of hold back on this. I really thought Emma's point was very, very interesting, because I understand the educational deficit for the year 10s and year 12s. I'm a teacher at Dave's school at East London Science School. But I think that the 11s and year 13s are in such a difficult situation, and I think we should teach them. Their exams have gone away, and I've been teaching my year 13s because they would have been at their peak right now, about to take their A-levels. So I want to teach them. I want to see where they would have got to. I want to intellectually engage with them. You would have taken your exams now. What are you worth? I know I can't use that as evidence, but I want to know where they are at. So I think it's important that we as teachers take some kind of leadership, and we actually do teach the students. Last point, Claire's point's really interesting, because I wasn't really aware of the teachers' involvement in calling for a school closures. I've been living in a COVID bubble. I didn't see that. I know what happened at our own school, but I did go on to Twitter very briefly to look at the reaction to Joanna's article, and it was disgusting. It was absolutely disgusting. Teachers, English teachers, I'm an English teacher, that I respect, whose work I respect, were just being absolutely vile against Joanna's points. And I thought that's made me think about, the whole role of teachers in this whole situation. So thank you.
Okay, thanks. We've got a few more, and I'm going to get everybody in and then bring the others back. And actually, we are going over time, but we don't have any rent to pay, and Zoom is paid for, so we can just go over for a little bit. Okay, so can I now bring in Tony Gilland? Tony?
Hi, thanks very much, Shirley, and everybody for a fantastic discussion. Dave made a very important point right at the very beginning about social distancing within schools being unworkable, and quite a lot has been said about risk and different perspectives on how to handle risk. If we think about the supermarket situation, it seems to be working quite smoothly, seems to be sort of handled quite well. But if we think about how unworkable that would be in a school, but also how it would encourage young people to internalise the risk even further. Mm. So I have a real fear about the social distancing. I think the government's very keen on that, is going to push that, and with the current climate, I can't see that that's not going to happen. So I'm very keen to hear views on that social distancing. I personally would like to, I will argue against it as much as I can, because I think it's a major problem. But I have also heard the other week the Welsh First Minister make the point. It might be unworkable, it might be difficult, but perhaps we just have to do it to build confidence amongst teachers and parents. So I can see that argument, but I'm not keen on it. And I think social distancing is something that we need to minimise in schools as much as possible.
Thanks very much. Okay, can I now ask Kevin Rooney, please?
Two really quick things in a question. Just about, I think it was Emma, Jennie's daughter, about how she's lost her drive and her motivation because of the exam. I wonder, is that a problem with schools, that we think the only motivation the kids have is to do the actual exam, and the pursuit of learning and the exploration of knowledge for its sake is sort of like almost around.
We've lost him again.